Hey there, it's Andrea, and welcome to the Voice of Influence podcast. Today I have with me Margaret Wenigar. Margaret is the founder of Rising Tide. She coaches ambitious women seeking more, consults with tech startups ready to scale, and speaks on what allows people to live in their fullest potential. In addition, she serves as an advisor at Atlanta Tech Village and is a coach at Georgia Tech's entrepreneurial program, CreateX. She is also the host of Rising Tide Podcast, a podcast for career women to find inspiration, courage, and their voice. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation today, Margaret.
Hi, I'm so excited.
That's great. I'm so glad because there's so many things to talk about. And I guess in some ways it feels like yeah, we want to talk about women. I want to talk about women today if that's okay. I think that's a lot of what you talk about. So,
Yes.
um I think we've been talking about women succeeding at work for it seems like a little while now, but in other ways it feels like we're just like on the cutting edge of figuring out and implementing new mindsets, systems to really support women. And I wonder where you think we are on the timeline.
Yeah. So it's really interesting because it wasn't that long ago that there's been a lot of information. I remember Sheryl Sandberg's book Lean In was like the first like really big book that was very specifically written for women and their careers and trying to provide some sort of guidance. And that really wasn't that long ago. That was
No.
a little over a decade. And what's fascinating about a book like that that has now come to light in more recent years is that there was still very much an element of encouraging women to change themselves, right? Be like there were things that women need to do to be different to be able to operate well in these environments. And what I am seeing a shift in that I think is really powerful is more so it's less about women fix something about yourself so that you can be successful, and more let's take a bigger look at the systems that we're operating within that were never built for us, by us, or with us in mind. And so things like a perfect example from that book that everyone thinks of with Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In is the study on women will apply for jobs if they can check 10 out of 10 boxes, and men will apply if they can check 6 out of 10 boxes. And what has been found is Joan C. Williams has done a ton of great research on women in the workplace and biases that women face. And one of the things that she found is what's called the prove it again bias. And essentially, all this is that men and women they're evaluated very differently, where men are evaluated on their potential. So it would make sense that if they can check 6 out of 10 boxes, right, their potential kind of fills in the gap. Women are evaluated on performance. They're asked to demonstrate how they've been successful and how they've already done the job. So if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense that women would want to check 10 out of 10 boxes because on some intuitive level, they likely understand the system that they're operating within. So kind of coming back to answering your question, I think there's still a lot of education around how kind of what are the existing biases that are in the workplace. For women, it's understanding that so you can develop strategies around it. It's kind of evolving from saying women change something about yourself, more so to being like, let's better understand that there are differences between men and women and kind of honoring and respecting those, and really kind of looking to seek balance, right? We don't, it's not a us versus them, it's a collectively we have these very distinct skills and strengths, and so we're far more powerful when we can combine those and work together.
Mm. Yeah, that's really it's interesting and the research that you bring up. I'm listening to that and hearing other people's voices in my head. So I feel like I need
Mhm.
to ask the question,
Yeah.
how do they know
Mm.
that that women are being evaluated on their performance, where men are being more evaluated on their potential?
Yeah, so there's been a couple of different studies that there was one done on entrepreneurs. There was a Heidi and Howard Roizen, and all they did was they changed the name. Now Heidi was real, Howard was not. So all they did was they changed out the name. And so in the study, what they found is that when they presented Heidi, it was a class of MBA students that were evaluating, and she was evaluated with more concern. People perceived her to be more aggressive in her behavior, and they were reluctant to kind of recommend investing in her. She was an entrepreneur. Howard, on the other hand, again, literally nothing was different about Howard besides the name. He seemed like he would do a really great job. People were really encouraged by his performance, and thought that he could really, do great things. So there's studies like this where the Heidi and Howard is just one example where they've literally just changed a name and you get a very different response to the same credentials.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's discouraging and fascinating. And okay, so we've got work to do.
Yeah, it's one of those things. Like, I think so much of it is like knowledge is power. So again, it's like it is disappointing, and but like if we know and we understand, then it can inform how we want to show up. We can, choose the spaces we want to be in. But yeah, knowing what it is, because I think so often, and I fell into this in my own career, I thought that there was something wrong with me. And
Hmm.
so, because I didn't fully understand some of the forces that were at play, and it's not malicious, right? These are like
Right.
socially conditioned things. Like, people are not intentionally malicious, um, but it is helpful. I think a good starting point for us is just understanding it. So then we can recognize things for what they are instead of taking ownership or thinking that there's something wrong or broken about ourselves.
That's so fair. I think about growing up, like I don't what was your situation like when you were growing up? Did you grow up thinking you could do anything and you would have all these opportunities, or like what was that growing up environment like for you, and just your perception of your womanhood and what you could or couldn't do in life?
Yeah. Oh gosh, this is such a great question. So so a couple of things. One is that growing up, my mom she worked, and she was the breadwinner in our household. So I had that as a role model, and I was really proud of that. And
Mm.
she was in tech sales. She worked for IBM. She sold enterprise. At the time, she was selling like their physical, like the mainframes, and then she eventually got into selling software, and was always one of the top performers. And um, it was really difficult. My Right before my senior year, she had left IBM. She'd gone to another tech company, and she got fired. It was a very personal termination. She had, for the last 3 years, been in there what they call their inner circle, or it was like a presence club. So I knew she was a top performer. Her boss was actually a good family friend I'd known my whole life. He had always been around, and it was deeply personal in that, essentially, it was political. The CEO of the company had somebody else they wanted to put in the role, and so they got rid of her. And I watched the fallout that my mom went through. And so there was definitely a gender component to it, because my mom was one of two women within the sales organization. And so I went into college thinking, I'm never going to work in corporate. I'm never going to work in sales. And then fast forward 7 years, I was working in corporate and I was working in sales. And when I went to a company that had largely female leaders. It was about 50-50. And so in my mind, I thought, we have eradicated bias. We have solved the gender equity problem. I was so naive in my thought process, but because I could see women in leadership, I could see multiple women in VP roles. What I did pay attention to is none of them were in C-level roles, and there were leaders at every level up through VP. And so that, combined with the fact that I was an athlete, and so something that has been studied as well is female athletes they tend to have more confidence, they tend to have more self-esteem, and so they also tend to operate better in male dominated environments. So I think the combination of like my athletic background, I had seen my mother working in these environments, and then I had now come into an organization where there were a lot of women in power with men. I very much was like, the world is my oyster, anything is possible. that held true until I got pregnant.
Oh, yeah.
And then a lot of things changed and my eyes were opened, unfortunately, to the real realities of the current environment for women.
Oh gosh. I mean, it was like a cliffhanger now.
Yeah.
So what did you experience that changed your perception?
Yeah. So I had left the company I was at. We had moved from San Diego back to Atlanta, and I had joined a early stage startup. And about a year in, I was pregnant and with my first, and it was the company's first pregnancy. So the couple of the men that were on the leadership team with me, they had children, but there had never been a woman who had had a baby. So that was a whole experience of figuring out what we were going to do for a maternity leave policy, what that would look like, and they were very supportive on the front end. What happened when I got back is that this was still very much a time where time in the office was important. And so when I would go to leave at 5 o'clock to go get my newborn from daycare, a couple of my teammates started making comments. And so it started with, oh, interesting, you're leaving already. And so a lot of that pressure started creeping in because there's the the motherhood penalty, which is women are seen as less committed and less competent as a result of having children. And I felt that because the inferred implication of what they were saying is like, oh, are you really willing to work hard? I chose not to go to after hour happy hours, and this was a company where a lot of things happened outside of core business hours. And so, fast forward 5 months later, there were a couple of variables, but I ended up being fired.
Mm.
And then I went to another company, earlier stage than the one I was at. Um, and again, repeated the same process. I was the first pregnant woman. I had my second child. This time went way worse. When I told my boss I was pregnant, he said,
Wow.
ugh.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. We fought for the
What?
next, 7 months about the difference between maternity leave and short-term disability, and trying to communicate, like, if you're looking to hire women into this organization, this is important to kind of set the standard. I came back, I only took 8 weeks maternity leave. I still kind of tear up when I think about that choice, because it's a little bit disheartening that I gave so much of myself to a company and not kind of being at home with this newborn child. And came back, first day I was demoted and I was blamed for performance while I was out. I spent the week kind of getting my hands on what had happened, figured out 3 things we could do, presented on Friday on strategies for how we could get back on track for that current quarter. And then on Monday, I was fired. So it was my first 2 children. Within less than 6 months, I was fired after having children.
Wow. Do you just have the two kids then?
I have 3.
So when you got pregnant with your third kid, was there any like residual trauma from like, oh my gosh, does this mean something bad for me, even though you're excited about your kid? You know what I mean?
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, I think
So complicated.
it's so complicated. Ironically, this was during the pandemic, and I actually
Mhm.
got late. They didn't know I was pregnant, so I want to be very clear about that. But I was part of a riff when I was
Oh my
5 months
gosh.
pregnant. So I was like, oh my gosh, every year I've had a baby, I've been fired. But it definitely, yeah, it took a toll. It took a big toll because I think it had, um, I was really upset at the fact that in every single one of those scenarios, I had been uh, overperforming. The results were there. I had built really strong, high functioning teams that uh, they loved working with me. And I think that was what was so heartbreaking about it, is like this, just kind of aspect of who I am as a woman, something really powerful, right? This ability to procreate and kind of continue on civilization was being held against me and was seen as a detraction. And I think it's, again, right, it's more a reflection on kind of how like work environments have been built where a very human experience is seen as inconvenient and
Mm,
problematic
mm,
for operational efficiency.
yeah.
Even and then even in this case, right, like even with the results there, that couldn't override some of those like entrenched belief systems. So yeah, it definitely um it built up a little bit of scar tissue and reluctance too, to kind of put myself back in environments and being very wary of kind of, I think in some ways really helping me be much more mindful about um, who was I going to be working with, who was I going to be working for, taking a really hard look at their leadership team, top to bottom. So I think in that way, it helped me. I was a lot less naive going in
Mm,
to looking for roles, to seeing, would someone like me, as a mother with young kids, be supported in an organization?
In my business, one of the things that I say a lot is it has to do with humanity, our humanity as people. And I'm
Yeah.
like, it has to be okay. So, like, it has to be okay if my mom gets sick. It has to be okay if I need to go to the hospital, if I need to go to a funeral, or if somebody gets pregnant. Like, this
Yes.
has to be okay. Otherwise, who are we? And what are we here for? What are we doing? It just
Right.
I'm like crying. Like this is making me tear up. Like I'm like it has to be okay that you got pregnant. And like if employers could have that mindset, like no, it has to be okay because we are human. Like we have to
Right.
build businesses and institutions that can handle that. That can handle our humanity.
Right. Well, and I think that's, it's interesting. I've done a lot of research in the last year on the work environment. How did we get here? And, I think there were some really meaningful shifts that happened in the 80s and 90s. And really you can kind of point to Jack Welch, who was the CEO of GE, as he was a very big catalyst of, at the time in the late 1970s, the global market was really emerging. It was becoming a lot more competitive. And one of a leading economists had talked about shareholders as really like they were kind of king. And Jack Welch took that and ran with it. And as a result of that, what ended up happening is companies started living and dying by the quarter and the year. And as a result, we saw things like mass layoffs becoming common practice.
Mm,
We saw things like the rank and yank. So he implemented stack ranking. And like that's, where you had to put 10% in the top, 80% in the middle, and a 10% in the bottom. And every year that 10% was fired. And he was really big on a campaign against loyalty. He did not want people getting comfortable within an organization and staying there. And so I think that was a really big transition in how companies viewed employees, where they stopped being assets and they started shifting over to expenses. And even when you look at organizations, it's crazy to me to think that the HR function in some places rolls up under a chief operating officer. That's scary, right? Because operations is all about numbers, data, efficiencies, and right, a very human function is being put under a very data focused function. Like it affects women, but what I'm seeing now too is especially millennial men, I'm seeing like like the system's breaking for them too.
mm,
All of these short-sighted strategies to hit these quarterly numbers, these annual numbers. The length of a Fortune 500 company has shrunk
mm,
from mid 30s to 21 years. We're seeing that like the rate of layoffs is just, it's only rising, especially in the tech industry. And we're on an unsustainable trajectory. Something has to give. And I think what's positive is historically women and minorities were negatively impacted. And now here are men, white men, who are also experiencing the same pain. So we kind of have a unified challenge,
mm.
which gives me hope and encouragement that like that is a important catalyst to transformation, because now we all kind of have a shared cause that we want to work towards.
Mm. Interesting. This last year in particular, there's been like this really fast rising tide in interest in women's sports.
Hmm.
And so you were talking about athletes, and I was like, oh, yeah. So this is what's so fascinating. I mean, like last night, I watched a WNBA game for the first time because I wasn't interested before. Caitlin
Right.
Clark was playing, and they were on Disney Plus, and I was like, I'm curious, like I'm
Mhm.
curious, and I don't even like. Okay, and I live in Nebraska, where the UNL hosted a sold out event in their Memorial Stadium, which is a football stadium, for just volleyball
Yeah.
last August. And so to see this progression this last year, and then, women being watched more than men, even for March Madness, I mean, that was fascinating and it's exciting, and not necessarily because it's a competition at all, and not because it's a competition, just because it's like, oh, yeah, like look at us like go. Like I'm so excited
Right.
about it. And I'm curious. First of all, you can say whatever you want to about that topic, but also what impact do you think that women's sports could have on women in the workplace?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I mentioned earlier that, women playing sports is incredibly powerful for confidence and self-esteem. So
Yeah.
I think even just at the youth level, and even playing in high school, like it does a lot for girls and for young women in their confidence and their self-esteem, and again, right, in navigating, they've been like in very male dominated spaces, so, and there still are a lot of those in the work environment. So I think that in and of itself is really great. Um and I think what's really exciting is this ability to, for a lot of things, social media can be very problematic, but in this case, this is a great example of so much of why people know Caitlin Clark's name has to do with social media and like little highlight snippets of just the crazy things that she was capable of doing. And I think there's a really, I haven't done a ton of research in this area, nor have I educated myself. But what I sense is like, if you see it, you believe you can be it.
Yeah.
And I think there's an underestimation that like young girls want to be these powerful athletes. Young girls want to be able to do these things. And so having exposure to women doing that, like the women's U.S. soccer team was really big for us. We even gymnastics, and like like
Yeah.
gymnastics is a little bit trickier, right? Because there's a lot of restrictions, but like I think it's spreading into more mainstream sports. And so I think it's really positive because I think it can become a very virtuous cycle of young girls can see these women who are having careers in sports and able to draw a crowd. And then that encourages more girls to participate in sports, which is going to help boost their confidence. So I think there's a lot of really beautiful things that can come from from what's happening and this momentum, and so many of the women who are out there who have kind of persevered. Allison Felix is another one, right? I mean, her writing her book about her experience with Nike and talking very openly about being pregnant as an athlete and the lack of support that they got. I mean, those are the things that are really going to help, right? Because again, it's knowledge is power.
Mm, yeah. Yeah. A couple more things come to my mind, like even just like girls seeing women do these really cool skills. Like, oh, I could do that too. Like,
Mm-hmm.
like pass the ball behind my back, or, like just a really great assists and whatever it might be, like, oh, I could shoot from the logo. Oh, and like make it a lot, not necessarily because they can, but just like even aspiring to do the skill is a
Mm-hmm.
huge thing. And then working towards doing a skill that is significant and actually achieving something is, I think that's amazing. And then I also have thought about like it's not just women watching these women's sports. And so even men, and I think men who are willing to look at it and say like, oh, this is amazing, like, and be excited and interested, they're also potentially, their mindset could be shifting around women in the workplace too.
Yeah. It's interesting. I do think I've had to, it's funny. I have several men who will come up to me and they'll tell me that they have daughters. And they're saying it because like they are paying much closer attention to media coverage on the female experience at work, and that like because there's been more information out there and there's been more discussion around biases that women face and setbacks that purely because of your gender you can come up against. I think it's interesting that men are paying attention, if nothing else, because they want to create a better future for their daughters. These are these precious little humans who they think should be anything they want to be, and they also understand their very difficult realities that they might face. And so I think there's some really positive aspects too. I see a lot of men that are aiming to understand, that want to ask questions, that are looking to learn more because they want their daughters to have every opportunity that they have. And so I think that's, again, right, I think that's a byproduct of having information out and available so people can understand it. And then in this case, their motivator has to do with this precious little child that they love so much.
So you had mentioned that you didn't want to do as much of that sort of outside networking um, during that second or after your second pregnancy and birth experience. And we lead some leadership development programs that are lengthy. They're like 10 months long. And sometimes we have women come through who are in that particular place where they have little kids and they have very strong like work-life boundaries. So they're like, okay, I'm going to give it all I got while I'm here, but then I'm going home. I have to.
Yeah.
And it appears I see supervisors, who are staying late, who are covering for other people, that sort of thing. And so what I see as a supervisor is not something that I want because it doesn't allow for those strong work-life boundaries. And yet companies are saying, we need supervisors. We need people to step up into these leadership positions. We've seen them come through and they're like, amazing. They would be great leaders. But they're like, no, thanks. I'm not going to do. Okay, what are your thoughts?
Oh my gosh, I have so many thoughts. Okay, so this hits on several things. The first is the meritocracy trap. So I think one of the things that has become very problematic in our country specifically is the illusion of the American dream and this idea that if we work really hard and we do a really good job, we can kind of further ourselves and advance ourselves. And the meritocracy trap has really created issues around productivity has somehow been equated to grinding, hustle. And the idea of, leisure or relaxing has almost been met with disdain. And there's been a glorification of working ourselves into the ground. And so one of the biggest problems that I see is there's that, right? It's like we have to, in some ways, break the hustle culture and the meritocracy trap, and that's hard, right? That's very deeply entrenched. It is absolutely becoming more competitive. The ability to get into college right now, we've seen even in the last 20 years, places like Stanford have declined from 15% acceptance rate down to 5% acceptance rate. So like there's no denying things have become more competitive. But productivity is not equal to time and seat, the amount of effort. And what I have observed about women who have children, and to kind of to your point, something that is underappreciated, and I will say this as loud as I can for as long as I can, they are incredibly diligent about prioritization. And they get incredibly efficient because they have to be. So they know, right? I am here during these core hours and this is what my schedule is. And so they get really good about understanding what is most important for the business. What are the initiatives that need to take focus? What are the things that are less critical? And so when you think about people you want working for your organization, you don't want the person who's going to say yes to everything, who just keeps working. You want the person that's going to take time to understand what is really going to move the needle, what's going to make sure that we hit the outcomes we are aiming for. And then what are the things that we don't need to focus on right now because they're a distraction? So to me, these are women who are incredibly good at focusing on what actually matters. And to me, it's a big miss for companies if they don't recognize that skill set that these women possess, and valuing that and really rethinking what does good leadership look like. Because it's not the person who's just grinding it out in the office. That person is wildly inefficient.
Mm. Yeah, and the things that you just mentioned, I think are even worth a woman being able to identify those as strengths for herself and
Mm-hmm.
then advocating for herself too.
Absolutely. Well, and I was thinking about this before I came on today because this is one of the biggest pieces, especially for women. But I have this conversation a lot because um, a lot of times I have the conversation because the people I talk with have really dynamic backgrounds. In the interviews that I've done on the podcast, I've had over 172%. These women made at least one major career change. And what I found is that when they are going to companies, oftentimes it's our human nature to want to put people in boxes. We get so much information thrown at us that our way of kind of consuming and understanding all of that information is we kind of compartmentalize things into these boxes. And so when somebody doesn't fit within the box, it is oftentimes rejected. And what is so important, especially for women, is taking time to own your story.
Yeah.
Really looking back at the decisions that you've made, the experiences that you have, the through lines in your career. Because I promise you, even if you've made lots of changes, there are through lines in your strengths, your superpowers, your experiences, things that you bring. And you have to own that when you're in conversation with people. And so that, being pregnant and kind of having that superpower prioritization, that's important to convey. And then it's the same thing with all of your skills and experiences that you have, is making sure that you take time to claim them and then to be able to craft a story around helping people understand just how amazing you are.
Mm, yes, I love that. I think that's really important because it sort of helps you own your own credibility and at the same time be able to share it.
As women, we draw confidence from experience.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because um, psychologists have studied confidence in men and women. And what they found is that men and women's confidence doesn't intersect until our mid 40s. And the kind of the belief is like, okay, men are probably largely overconfident in their 20s, and women are not, like they're not, their confidence doesn't align with what they're actually capable of in their 30s. And so what's interesting is like this exercise of taking credit for what you've done, actually taking time to reflect and claim it, that is really powerful in nurturing your confidence, because for us as women, it comes from experience. And so when we recognize what we've done, we take full credit for it. We don't chalk it up to being lucky. We don't give away all of the credit to our team, right? We take all ownership for our part. That's also really important in building our confidence.
Yeah, love that. Okay, gaps in employment. Ah, there's so many things to
Yeah.
talk about. Oh my gosh. Okay, so this is
Yes.
obviously a toughie. I mean, uh, yeah, like I took years. And so when I came back and when I was like, okay, well, I wasn't like coming back per se, but I was like starting to think about, okay, my kids are in preschool and in elementary school. What do I want to do now? Like it was a tough thing to imagine and to get through. And I think that's the case for a lot of women. And sometimes women who have been at home, staying at home with kids. And this happens a lot as well, unfortunately, where they're in abusive relationships and they finally are able to get out, but then they're stuck without having had the education or the experience. And yet they've been managing 4 children, plus dealing with an abusive spouse or whatever for all these years. And so they have all this ability to work with people, to get things done. And yet, how can they come back into the workforce and make enough money to support children and all that too? Okay, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a perfect kind of tie into what I was just saying about the like having the story. So again, right, like that path we know is attached with stigmas. Like career gaps are seen as like people view those as negative, which is again, it's a belief that I look forward to disrupting in the future because it's not accurate, right? There was an intentional reason why this woman chose to step away, whether it was to stay at home with her children for several years. Maybe it was to take just a career sabbatical, and she wanted to kind of step away, get reoriented, and come back. And so there's a couple of things that again in this research with women, and it was done in pivots, but I believe that this holds true in the example you used. Taking a look at ourselves with regards to the skills we possess, not the titles that we hold. So this is really important. And when we think about like, what did I do? Like managing, like we use the example, managing a household of 4 kids, right? So there's likely things like coordinating schedules,
Yeah.
and like it might be meal planning for the week, like looking at what are the skills that you're using to essentially run the household. And you could do the same thing for work. What were the things that you did? And what's really great is I find that you don't have to figure this out on your own. So if you can at least capture those skills, then take them to people that you trust, that know you and care about you. And you
Mhm.
can ask them and say, I'm really good at these things. What does that sound like to you? And see what sparks for them. And that's usually a really great jumping off point. If you have no idea where to start, is taking like looking at the skills that you have. What are the things that light you up so you get a ton of energy around, you love doing it, you could do it again and again and again. And also paying attention to what are the things that you are just exhausted after you've done them, right? That informs the energy givers. Those are things that you want to keep doing. And so when you take that to your trusted community and ask them for ideas, this is a really great way to invite people to not only help you, but also what I've found is that they also usually there's another step that they can help you with. They might have an introduction, they might know a company you should look at, or they give you a title or a role that might be worth checking out. But it at least gets the process started of figuring out where you want to go. And then, as you're explaining it to people, you also get better at articulating it. And so the more at bats you get at explaining it, the stronger your story becomes because you have practice at doing it. So that to me has been a pattern I've seen of what women do when they are looking to make major changes, where they're looking to come back from gaps, is that they kind of follow that process of the self exploration and then tapping their trusted network. And then, right, kind of each step building on itself from there.
Mm, that's good advice. So related, but a little different, is that women are often caregivers, period. It's just what
Mhm.
tends to happen. And it's not necessarily bad at all. Um, it's our children, it's our parents. It can be a lot of different things. But it's more expensive and more difficult to find caregivers for our children and our parents.
Mhm.
So there are a lot of women saying, how can I figure this out as, to work from home? What could
Mhm.
that look like for me and that sort of thing? But I do think that there's plenty of questions still around how do you measure productivity and efficiency and all that kind of stuff to really justify remote work, because even Walmart last week said that, or this week I think it was, said that they're pulling everybody from working at home and bringing them back to work at their headquarters, along with some other things, but a lot of concern around that. So talk to me about this topic.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because to me again, like so much of my background in sales was about root causes. If we weren't seeing the revenue numbers we wanted to see, like what is behind that? Is it a skill issue that we need to train the team? Is it a market issue? Maybe a new competitor has surfaced and is winning, and we're going head to head and we're losing to them. Is it a product issue where we need to kind of inform the strategy? What is at the crux of the issue? And when I think about remote work, it's one of those things where it's not surprising that companies are struggling with this. When we look at, especially in middle management, how little investment has been put into how to manage people, how to interview people. Why would remote work be any different, right? How do you effectively manage a remote workforce? These are things, these are skills that people have to be trained in. It's not
Mhm.
something that you just know how to do. And so I would be curious, right, to look at some of these organizations that are pushing back on it of what is the investment that they have made in enabling remote workforces. There's a great guy that I used to work with, actually. His name's Henry O'Laughlin, and I'll send you the link because I can't remember the name of it exactly, but he basically, his content, he built and ran a successful business that was fully remote. And so he has a lot of content and resources around how organizations do this, and he's a big believer in it. And so, um, I would say for individuals that are looking to work remote, like, this is where, am I being productive? This is where clarity of expectations becomes really important. So, like, what are the objectives you're aiming to achieve? And, so having that as your North Star, and are you successfully executing on those objectives? If you're doing that, then you're doing your job, right? That's the mutually agreed upon, criteria for success in this role. So I think that's really important, is establishing, what does success look like in this role? What are the objectives that we're looking to achieve? Um, and then, yeah, I mean, flexibility for women is a huge driver. I think another big thing that needs to be accounted for is um, environments that are hybrid. Being in the office does have its advantages for career advancement. And I don't think we've fully seen what the implications are for career advancement, particularly in hybrid environments. Fully remote, it's different. But I think that there's just some things to consider. But so much of what I would say is um, knowing what's important to you. If the most important thing is having a stable income that allows flexibility and work that you enjoy doing, then it may not be as critical for career advancement. It may not be as important to, like, the logo that you work for, right? It may be like this company, those are the most important things that drive your decision. And so I think being really clear on what you're like, who you want to work for, why you want to work for them, is really important, especially for women, and not comparing and to what other people are doing necessarily, but having that clarity for yourself. Because, it's okay to not want to move up.
Mm.
We
Yeah.
don't need everybody who wants to lead. So I got a little off on a tangent there, but to me, this is one of those, I don't agree with the forced returns. I think there's a lot of value and access to talent that you open up when you expand beyond your primary locations. And so, but a lot of that requires an investment in the technology, the training to set up your leadership teams to be able to support effective remote work.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm kind of curious how this is going to play out in terms of um, almost segregating the workforce.
Mm.
So, what does, who are the people that we're bringing back to work, and if we're forcing, if we need to have everybody at on site, how does that workforce look different than somebody else's with a similar business but a hybrid, or you know, a hybrid mostly likely situation. And I'm kind of wondering how that's going to play out in terms of culture and innovation, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, it will be interesting. And I think what the pandemic did so beautifully is it amplified what existed.
Yeah.
So we saw companies who struggled terribly because they had shaky foundations. They did not have strong cultures. They had poor communication. And so when forced to make changes, they didn't have the foundation to support that. Versus other companies shined, right? They were kind of primed for it because they had the foundation. So the pandemic amplifying what existed. There is a lot of opportunity to research what's going on, and companies are going to be different. Who they are working with, what their client base looks like. Again, I come from a world of sales where that role does not require you to physically be any place. You can literally do, especially inside sales, you can do that from anywhere. And that has been the case for a long time.
Mm.
And so, but then, I think the things that you care about as a leader is like, can you have leaderboards? How do you encourage people to kind of rally to overperform? How do you encourage people to support one another and share knowledge? And again, right, a lot of this is things that have systems. There is a lot of technology that enables for these things, but it's a matter of putting the systems in place to enable that, as opposed to, maybe defaulting to what we know, to
Mm.
the way we've always done it.
Mm. Okay, Margaret, what is the world you dream of?
Yes, I love this. Yes, because my dream is for better. I think so. The world I dream of, I don't believe that the machine that exists today, especially in the US, I don't believe that kind of corporate machine will go away. That would be that would be amazing, but I don't think it will go away. What I dream of is, in the coming decades, that leaders who want to build differently, who want to build more human organizations, longer view organizations, more sustainable organizations, are going to be able to build a critical mass. And individuals have the opportunity to choose which environment they want to go into. And this is something I get very excited about. During the pandemic, I interviewed a lot of female founders, because one of the things that happened during the pandemic is it was a catalyst for women who were thinking about building, and either when their roles were eliminated, they were just beyond burned out, they decided now was the time to take action. And so the rate of women starting businesses has risen, and even fractional workers is on the rise since 2020. And so I'm very optimistic that a lot of what I've seen in the women that are building businesses is that they're building differently than men, and that what they're building, why they're building, how they're building, it's very different. The what is oftentimes a problem that they see that affects a community that they care about. And so they are looking to implement a solution. And why they build, it's almost like a calling, as opposed to, they're not looking to just make money, right? They're looking to solve this problem. And then the way that they're building their companies is they want it to be around for a long time, because they want the problem that they're addressing to stay addressed. They don't want a solution to go away. And so I have a lot of hope and optimism around female founders serving as a catalyst to really start building that critical mass, and helping just create a different, more human, more sustainable way of working.
Mm.
So that's my vision for the future.
All right. Two more questions. First, how can people find you and your podcast, etc.?
Yeah, thank you. So I have a website. It's just margaretwenigar.com. I like to say I do my best content on TikTok. So I'm at Rising Tide Podcast on TikTok. It's my same handle for Instagram. And then you can find me on LinkedIn. I post a good bit on LinkedIn as well. And then Rising Tide Podcast, it's just Rising Tide. So it's on anywhere you listen to podcasts, probably wherever you're listening to this one. If you just type in Rising Tide, you should be able to find it easily.
You recommend people people like us do TikTok then? I have thought about it, and I just haven't really bitten the bullet yet. Just what are your thoughts on that? That is not my second question, by the way. This is one and a half.
So for me personally, the reason I did it is I'm a verbal communicator.
Yeah.
And I have forced myself into being a good writer.
Okay.
But it's not natural. And so what I find for TikTok is the video editing tools are really easy to use, which I love. But it's a really great place for me, because I can quickly make a TikTok video, and then oftentimes what comes out, I can transcribe and turn into written content. So for me, it's almost my creative process.
Mm.
I've found, I think I've found a really good community there. And so anyway, so I think it's kind of twofold. Is like, I personally have enjoyed being on the TikTok platform. And then it's also been very helpful to my personal creative process of having ideas, but wanting to get them out verbally versus having to write them.
Okay. All right. So link into all that in the show notes, I promise. But last question. What last piece of advice would you want to give somebody who wants to have a voice of influence?
Hmm. Know who you are. This is, I think, one of the most important things and one of the biggest things I've seen, again, in the research of women who have been able to build incredibly successful careers and to have influence is that they took the time to understand themselves. And so that is, they knew their core values, they knew their energy givers and takers, they owned their story and their experiences, and they were really clear on their superpowers. And so, when we know those things, we have seasons of life. So, what's most important to us will change over time. And so, taking those things and coupling with at this point in time, what is most important to me? And where do I want to show up and make an impact? But using internal information and data as your compass. That to me is, if you want to have influence, that's the most important thing you can do.
Mm. Margaret, we could go on and on. I love this conversation. Thank you so much. I'm so glad that we did this.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. This has been such a treat. I've loved the conversation.
Me too.